I'm Scott Pearson. I'm a science fiction writer. I've written 3 short stories and 2 novellas for Simon & Schuster's Star Trek line, and so that's where I've really had to deal with the challenges of writing in an established universe.
My name is Jason Glazer. I'm also an author, and I did a science fiction novel called Double Jump that draws on a lot of the tropes and the character types from video games, and so I thought about that, but I've also contributed to a bunch of children's nonfiction and textbook materials and things like that. And as I was talking with the other panelists before, involved in discussions on how to adapt various licenses to licensed children's literature and stories.
You're the one I need to talk to.
Probably.
Cool. My name is Charlotte Fullerton. I'm primarily a television writer. I write kids' cartoons, but I also write video games, children's books, interactive talking graphic novels, comic books. Basically, if it's kids, everything down to the placemats at Burger King, pretty much anything that has to do with kids. But the main things the properties you might know me from: Ben 10 and My Little Pony, Kim Possible, all kinds of stuff like that.
I'm Sarah Prentice, and I volunteered as the moderator for this. I also write trivia.
Cool. So today's panel, are you moderating or am I?
No, go for it.
Going for it. Okay. We're talking about writing in established universes, which means, of course, playing in other people's playgrounds, other people's sandboxes with their toys. So there's always a little bit, and I guess you guys can speak to that even more, about dealing with characters that aren't yours. So you think of writing as being, you can write anything, and cartoons in particular, sky's the limit, you can draw anything. So, there's no limitations, but there kind of are, budget-wise and otherwise, but especially when the characters aren't yours. You can't just say, I'm going to have Yoda do this, or I'm going to have Twilight Sparkle do that. I mean, that's what fan fiction is. You can just go to town. Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm with you on that. But you have to be true to the characters, or they're not the characters anymore. And I come at it from, even as a fan point of view, growing up, particularly a fan of the Muppets and of Star Wars, anytime there were at the time, a lot of ancillary properties, marketing-driven things, where the characters would show up in other places, live or in print. And I knew, even as a little girl, that's not Luke Skywalker. That's not the real Luke Skywalker. That's not the real Kermit the Frog. And it's not the actor, and it's not the puppeteer, the voice. It's the writing. It's the character doesn't sound like themselves. That's not their voice. They're not just the choice of words. That's not what the whole actor trope about, what's my motivation? What's my character? That's not just a joke. It's true. It's kind of what.
It's true, but it's a high wire act. All you can do is write the way you perceive this character, but everyone out there has their own intimate perception of who these people are. My last Trek novella that came out was an ebook that came out last summer called The More Things Change, and it was a Chapel and Spock story. And one time, actually just a few weeks ago, I did what you should never do as a writer. I was reading some reviews. It took me several months to go back to looking at any reviews for it, because the first review I saw for it was, "This is the worst Star Trek book ever." But it's all subjective, so it doesn't really hurt, because you can't please everyone. But when I was looking at some reviews just a couple of weeks ago, one review like, "Oh, I give this 4 stars. It was great. This sounded exactly like Chapel and Spock." And then the next review was, "This was really bad. This didn't sound at all like Chapel or Spock." And so we all bring our own perceptions to these characters, and you try your best to be true to how you perceive them. It doesn't guarantee that that's how the audience perceives them.
True, but you do study the characters' voices, the choice of words,
Oh, yeah.
Certainly not like just catchphrases, everybody would know that.
Oh, yeah.
Who says what, but I would think in addition to character voice and all that, you guys have to deal with the story that you're telling.
Yeah.
And whether that falls into line with the type of story that would work with that property.
Yeah, because you go through an extra layer. When you're writing your own fiction, you really just have to deal with your editor. But if you're writing a licensed property like Star Trek or Star Wars and anything like that, it also gets reviewed by the license holder. So my story goes to the editor, and when the editor likes it, then it goes to a person at CBS, CBS Studio Products, or whatever the exact name is these days, and they go through it, and they can redline stuff and say, no, this doesn't work, you can't do that. And so sometimes you can go around and around until you get everyone happy.
Do you Trek? Since you got the Trek background, and you're right here, I'll ask you about it. But the Trek Beyond, or I think that's what it's called, where it's like sort of the ongoing original series, like Grant Imahara's on it, or whatever.
Oh yeah.
I can't remember if I got the title right, but have you been watching that? Because that's got to be an interesting fit too, because they're trying to capture a feeling from a time that was.
And of course, since they're a fan production, they don't have to answer to CBS or Paramount coming in and saying, no, you can't do that. They can do whatever they want. But of course, they're still trying to keep the audience happy and capture that tone of the original series. And yeah, they've done some interesting work on there.
That is an interesting blend of, it's fan fiction because they can do whatever they want,
Mm-hmm.
but because they are fans and they want things to be just right, you know, in terms of the characters and not character, situation, stories, the whole world, they're holding themselves to a pretty high standard, and possibly a better standard, or not better, but a more accurate standard than even the licensor would hold them to sometimes. And that actually kind of leads, I know you had a question that something I was going to mention, but
There's a criticism of that of characterization, that when there's different writers going after one character, that they'll just narrow down what they are to a kind of parody of themselves and
Of themselves or
of
the
the character, where like the character will sort of in order to keep it not doing anything out of character, who they are just becomes very boring in one note because everybody is afraid to step out of bounds.
Can I say that is lousy writing? There's concerns about that even within the television series itself, on a big property like a Ben 10 or a Star Wars or sort of My Little Pony, anything that has existed for years and been redeveloped over time, Ninja Turtles, and that you have a group of not one person writing every single word, every single episode of the series, never mind the ancillary properties. The story editor, the head writer, or the producer, this should be a point person, executive, whoever it is, who has everything in their head, who is the uber fanboy girl of that property, that knows, because everybody writing on the show, obviously they got the job because they can write character, and maybe even they know that show very well. But only one person, usually maybe two if they're tag teaming it, knows what's going on across the board. Because if you're just the writer, you only know your story or your book or your episode or whatever you're working on. You don't know where they're going 20 episodes from now. You don't necessarily know where they've been 10 before because they haven't aired yet. Like, you could be as up to date as possible, as a fan of something, and not know. When I came into Kim Possible, it was the last season after they'd been canceled and they were brought back, and I was a huge fan of this show. Nicole Dubuque, who's another guest here, is the one who got me my job on that show. She was already on it. I owe her. I'm indebted forever. It's one I loved that show. She wrote Coco Moves. I know, isn't that awesome? But having been a huge fan of the show, I'd only seen what had aired, of course, so I didn't even know going in, and pitched them a whole bunch of ideas, which none of them went. They ended up assigning me one, but they liked the ideas. They thought that I understood their show and everything. So it's tricky to, even when you're in the loop, you're not entirely in the loop. You could be a writer on the show and still not know everything that's going on. So there's got to be somebody who, and I'm not sure what it is in publishing, I assume it's the editor, but they may not even know what the licensor has, planned. It's also proprietary because they're trying to hold things back from the fans and dole things out. It's really tricky because they hold them back from the writers also.
In the world of comic books, that sort of breakneck daring speed happens all the time, even within its own medium, because they're having to adjust and adapt to storylines that are going on concurrently through other writers, and taking over stuff that was set up by other writers who may have quit, died, got canned, something, they're going in a new direction. And so there's things, yanking back and forth all the time, and that's just sort of a hazard of the biz, where you got to put the best story out there that you can, and then try and fit it a little bit to make it work or whatever. Marvel Comics is infamous for the no prize. For those of you who know about that, where people would catch an error in the book, particularly if it was things like continuity or whatever else, but then they had to come up with a reason why. It wasn't actually an error. It was to sort of keep the disbelief going or whatever, and so then you would receive a no prize, so to speak, for coming up with the solution.
Do they still do that now with the internet and all? Everybody
I believe they do. Yeah, they instantaneously send you no prize.
Cool. I want to make sure you're included in this, please.
I will try.
Jump in.
Oh, I forgot it.
Okay. Talk to me at any time, I guess is what I'm saying. I see a question over here, yes.
Yeah, so for the people who are doing a little bit of adaptation from one medium to another, like, how do you keep the universe but move it to that bigger or smaller medium, or just different medium? Like, do you have any, like, what are your fears about, or do you have fears about moving it to different medium and changing things just because you need to change them for the medium and what that says for the universe?
Can I jump in on this just because we haven't talked about video games yet, and all the video games I've written have been licensed properties adapted from animated TV series. And I was very lucky, and not only had I already written on those shows, which is why I was hired to write the video games, but most, if all but one, of the video games I've written have been for Ben 10. So not only was I a writer on the show, I was the head writer on the show. So I knew everything that had happened, and I knew everything we were going to do. So they really got their money out of me writing the video games, because I knew exactly what was in continuity and what would be in continuity. This whole time travel thing, what will have been in continuity. It all comes down to kind of having a point person who knows what's going on, and there are very few, because everything's so proprietary and ever-changing. These guys are saying it's tricky to have a sort of a single brain that knows what all the arms are doing. I know my late husband was involved in a lot of these properties that transferred from comic books to animation and the other way around, and video games as well. And even he, was constantly frustrated by certain factors that these guys have mentioned about other writers writing concurrently with these same characters in other comic books, other video games, other TV shows. It's happening now in prime time more than ever, really. And I'm not sure who's the point person on all that stuff. That'd be great to have a panel about DC and Warner Brothers. Who's the uber brain that is, and not just that knows it, but has the authority to actually enforce, like, this is what we will all do. That's the tricky part. Knowing it is one thing, and just being frustrated, knowing that that this is not what so-and-so should say, because it's going to contradict 2 years from now when we do this. That's not going to make any sense. But you're not always in the position of power over every single project in every single medium. George Lucas is the only one I can think of who ever had that kind of power as an individual, to be able to, good or bad, in terms of creative decision making, he got to be the final say on, the creative decision across every medium, if he wanted to be. If he didn't, he could pawn off on somebody else. But that doesn't really answer your question about fear.
What I was going to say is that if you're adapting something from one medium to another, the thing to keep in mind is, what are the strengths of that medium you're bringing it to, and what are the weaknesses? If you're taking something from print and you're bringing it to a visual media like television or film, obviously with the book you can do more you know, getting inside of characters' heads, setting the faces, things like that. You've got the ability to work language in, you know, in description in which nothing's actually, you know, happened visually, you know, and sometimes, and if you were to just, you know, picture the book happening as a movie, you'd have sections where they're, you know, like walking down the street or things like that, you know, or whatever. And so with film, you have, you know, the sharp visual, you know, abilities. You have the ability to jump, you know, from scene to scene rapidly, or even juxtapose images that come at different points in the book, but they fit very thematically together in the thing. So you have to keep in mind, you know, not the source material. I mean, obviously you're going to get all the material you need out of that, but the strength of what you're doing, you know, why people, you know, want to read comic books or you know, see the TV show or a movie or listen to it as a radio drama or whatever it is that you're adapting it for, put it, you know, taking it into a video game. You have to concentrate on the strengths of the medium that you're adapting to, and then find a way to make the source material, you know, flow into those. If you're trying to make it evoke too much of the medium it was, it's going to fail.
Yeah, it ties into one of the other challenges when you're, like, for a story like Star Trek that's been around for decades, many people have worked on the arcs of these characters over decades, and some of these characters have had profound transformations over time. If you look at Spock in the original series, and then compare that to Nimoy's performance of Spock in movies, where he's kind of reached this peace between his Vulcan and human halves. When you start to work on a Star Trek story, you have to be very aware of when exactly that story is set. And you have to be true to the character at that time period, and you have to make sure that you don't fall into some of the patterns that the character had decades before. And it gets complicated over time because so many people have done it. And related to some of the stuff that you were saying, at a certain point, some of the books, when you're writing a book for Star Trek, one of the rules that you're given from your editor is you have to maintain continuity with all the filmed material. You can't do anything that breaks something that they said in a movie or a TV show. That gets complicated because there are times where the TV shows have broken each other, and then you have to kind of find a way through there. But then, so someone writes a great Star Trek book in 1990, and then other filmed stuff comes after that, that conflicts that. At a certain point, some of those stories kind of fall out of continuity, and then when you're writing a new story, you can ignore those novels because they've been kind of, you know, pushed aside by new material.
Painted over, we like to say.
Yeah.
Well, like in Star Wars, just thrown on the pile.
Yeah. And so
To the mind's eye, man, was still lost in time.
it can be a
Timothy's odds.
very complicated juggling act to keep track of all these different continuities and make them make sense. One of the ways that you can do it relates to what you were saying about in the print medium, you can get into people's heads. And so one thing that can be fun is approaching a person sort of psychologically and saying, okay, why is this character behaving this way now that's different from what they were behaving before? One of the challenges I had in my last Star Trek book was, so I was writing Dr. Chapel, and there's a lot of fans that really love Chapel and the Nurse Chapel character from the original series, but the Chapel in the 1960s TV series was often written in a pretty stereotypical way, and I was given a direct order from my editor that you know, this chapel is a modern chapel, this chapel needs to, you know, kick some ass. But then I had to balance, why did she kind of get all weepy and stuff back in the original 5-year mission, and now she's more like a full, strong character, a full person. And of course the reality behind it was just the differences in the way women characters are treated in 1960 and now. But I had to try to find an arc that went all the way through there. And it was very challenging as a writer, but that was also what was really fun about the story, both as a writer and just as a Star Trek fan. And an interesting side note to this particular novella is my original pitch had been a Spock and McCoy story, and the editor, thank goodness, said, we've had so many of those, how about a Chapel and Spock story? And I was like, wow, yes. Chapel never got her due in the original series, and so I got to really amp her up in this one.
That ties into something I was going to ask. When there's a lot of rules and a lot of things that you can't do, does that kind of like create a high pressure situation that makes you do something really weirder or different?
Sometimes.
It depends on when the deadline is.
I actually love having lots of rules. I went to Montessori school when I was in preschool, so I love having the structure to be chaotic within. And it's so helpful, and a lot of people I know, if you're writing fan fiction or shooting your own stuff, it helps to have constraints, because whenever you give people kind of just open, okay, blank page, write whatever you want, you're frozen because you've got too many options. You don't know what you're supposed to be doing. And it actually kind of ties back into your question, talking about writing in different mediums, and again, you guys can speak to this too, the structure of different mediums. Like in a comic book, you want to have your, like a cliffhanger, it's the page turn, basically, the bottom of the page, assuming they're keeping the ads where they're supposed to be, they're originally planned to be. It's the page turn that's going to be the reveal of whatever's coming next. And in movies, you tend to have a 3-act structure. In video games, it's the end of the level that's going to either, propel the game to the next. Television, it's sometimes teaser, 3 acts, tag, but now with the commercials being crammed in there, you never know how many how many little pieces you're going to have. I know in primetime that things are up to 6, 7 acts now. It gets difficult to, but it's difficult, but it's not like crazy making difficult the way you say. It's crazy making in deadline in the sense of, how am I going to, and how am I going to set something up that builds and then leaves you at a cliffhanger at the commercial that makes you want to come back and care about these characters and have them interact, and they actually get to speak to one another, and then we cut to a commercial. And
the established universes, sometimes from the outside you can have this sense like, there's so many rules, what can you do, there's all this, but really that's just, it's not that different from any sort of setting. If you're writing a World War II novel, you can't have certain weapons, or and so any particular setting is going to have a certain number of rules that you have to follow to make sure that it is authentic. And so writing for a licensed property isn't necessarily that much more nerve-wracking than writing a period piece or that's original.
And involves pretty much equal amount of research too. When you're saying a period piece where you really have to get to know the place and time, if not character, because if you're developing original characters there, but to really know what tools you have at your disposal to tell the kind of story you can tell.
One of the techniques that somebody that I worked with described was a refinement process, kind of like simmering it, which is why if they have enough time, they really enjoy it. And the quicker deadlines, the more hurried it gets, the more likely it is to just be, cookie cutter or whatever. But we talk about remaining true to the character and the source material and whatever else. And he said, if I could just let it similar, then the pure essence can sort of rise out of the material and become that thing that feels true to it. And he wrote a story that was part of a compilation of Batman stories many years ago. And it was in this simmering process that he wrote it that he discovered this narrative technique that just made it, for him, because it was, we were talking about the mediums, the comic is very visual, and action-paced, and of course it's book, it's all text. And so what he discovered in his writing that he then refined was that anytime that it was Batman, all of the narrative observations were matter of fact. It was like, you know, he was losing too much blood, he'd be dead within 3 minutes, you know, if the wound wasn't staunched, or, you know, the structure was not going to hold. It's matter of fact, that's the way it is. When it was Bruce Wayne, when he was not in, you know, his costume, then the narrative shifted and he was allowed those italicized thoughts like, what's he doing here? You know, things like that. There's more uncertainty about it. But when the mask was on, the narrative explanation was matter of fact. It wasn't opinion. It was, this is what's going to happen. This is what is happening. This is, and that became one of the strongest elements of that story, which there wasn't a lot of dialogue to it. And it was more a lot of this duality of this nature.
We don't have any time for simmering in television.
I know.
It's very, almost always first draft, last draft, done. You know, go. Which thankfully, that's the thing I can do is first draft, last draft. Which is, I guess, why I made my living in pressure cooker television.
I have a question for you, actually, with the video game adaptation. Yes, because, well, with the video game thing and adapting something, you take a license like Ben 10 and you apply it to video games, and it's a show that people watch and they enjoy and they experience it as the dialogue and action. Then it's a video game where, you know, they're playing it, but then inevitably the stuff that would be directly out of the show, the action, the stuff that they'd be viewing, the dialogue, what we call the, you know, the cutscenes, everybody just skips them to get back to the action.
So the game, you know, the overall story of what is occurring during the course of the game, but it is disappointing, yeah, when the cutscenes get cut. But that's not all there is to the story of the game.
But
that just progresses.
You want to talk about a challenge? It's the thing that should be the slam dunk, all the talking, the dialogue, the, you know, whatever else, and people are just like, next level, please.
But that also plays into what is the overall adaptation. It's not just the cutscenes. You got it's what is going to occur in the course of this game. What's the story of this game? And that's part of the fun for me is, especially on Ben 10, was making we were writing the first malware episodes in Ben 10 Omniverse at the same time as we were developing the first video game, and I was writing the story for that, knowing what we were going to be doing with this malware character, and played it up. I don't want to, you know, the game's been out for years now, so it's not spoiling. You're all probably children when you played it, showing my age. But it helped that I was developing both at the same, you know, literally physically me was developing the stories for both at the same time. I'm not really sure how, I can guess how frustrating it must be to be handed that video game assignment. Okay, you're going to write this story about a character you've never heard of, who's this villain who's going to have a major impact on everything, and you've got to come up with an original story that is going to play parallel but not conflict with the TV series that the kids are going to be watching concurrently when the game, because they place these licensed games to come out at a certain time in the cycle of the show, so that the kids have a certain knowledge. I don't know if it's the same, but I assume it's a property like Star Trek also heavily regulated by Star Wars, certainly regulated in terms of how and when they dole out the information to the audience. Like this book will come out now, and then the movie will come out then, and you know it's very specifically planned. But I can't imagine what it's like to not have that. I guess I'm trying to think of, like, Power Rangers was the very first anything I ever wrote that was produced, like back in the Mighty Morphin days and in the Zeo days. And I was working at Fox Kids Network, so I didn't have the inside track on the show, but I was doing the promotion for this, so I knew what was going on, even though I didn't have any control on it. So I've always been spoiled in that I've known the greater property and what was going on behind the scenes with those decisions while I was writing my own little, you know, piece of the puzzle. So I don't know that I've had the experience of having to write blindly for, not blindly, you know, knowing the characters and, you know, I'm a fan of this and I've done my research, but not, I mean, I can't imagine how frustrating that must be. Like, sort of, you have to be trusting, I guess, of who your editors and who your producer, who is the point person that's telling you yes or no, and just, I can't tell you why it's yes or no, but just trust me. And, all right. You know, like that's got to be one of those, okay, if you say so, I don't know.
Oh, well, since I've only done a few for them, I haven't had to deal with that issue that much because the things that I've written have been more standalone and haven't been tied in as much with some of the other things coming out. So, which was fine with me because then I had less stuff to juggle.
Yeah, trying to think of some of the other particular challenges about writing an established universes, given the topic of this panel here. That was a great question. I'm hoping other people will jump in with other questions.
I have a question.
Yay, thank you, and I want you to speak too, so take
Has there been a rule from on high that you have like bucked against or tried to circumvent? For instance, I've heard that Batman cannot get therapy ever in the DCU universe. The one most obvious thing to happen cannot happen. So is there something like that where like you are poking at into the writing or trying to get somebody to come around, like something that you want to do, but you're in there, but there's like a memo?
I haven't fought against anything. There's definitely a number of rules that you're given. No more mysterious half-siblings appearing out of nowhere for the major characters. You know,
Star Trek Pacific?
yeah, that's one of the rules. You know, and that trope has been visited by every one of the TV series. And you know, you can't kill off a major character. Obviously, you can't. At one point, there was like you can't introduce any more major past relationships for Kirk. So there's all sorts of stuff, but a lot of them have good reason, and so I never particularly bucked against them. But then one fun thing that happens, and this happens in the comic books as well, is then there are the times where you're given the exceptions. In Star Trek, they had a series called Myriad Universes, which was a series of novellas that were like Elseworld or whatever. You know, and so you were specifically given the opportunity to leave the continuity of the story and do whatever you wanted. And well, you still had to get approved by your editor
what if?
and CBS, but you got to do the what ifs, and so that was really fun. Now, have you worked on any of those sorts of things where you got to, where you did get to leave the rules behind a little bit?
I'm trying to think. The question about pushing back against something. There was one that is not. It applies. It's not in that it's an established universe, but it's not like a license. There was a project that I did. I wrote one of 8 books that were young adult books. That was part of a series, and because kids like series, they wanted all the books to drop at the same time. And so each book is about one character on this traveling baseball team. And the stories, they operate over the course of the same summer. And so the events will sort of overlap, but they all have their own stories. So we had to create this master online Google Docs Bible of what events were happening at various times. And like on what day in the summer this one character's parents get divorced, or whatever else, and all these other things that are happening. And so to make sure that everything remained chronologically consistent. And I wrote a scene at a party that was my favorite scene from the entire book.
Oh, this isn't going to end well, is it?
Yeah.
And it had to get cut because the setup to it and the actions that happened and the discussion that happened, none of it fit chronologically. I had done it before a lot of the things had fallen into place or whatever. I'm like, well, can we move it? Can we make it happen earlier? Can it be a memory or a flash? No. And so I have this scene that's my favorite thing that I wrote for that book, and it's not there. And it's not there.
In that case, was it kind of just like as authors were like throwing ideas out, like whoever got the idea out first, like that set the chronology, or?
Not quite. Before we all started, we had to put out the story arc for our character, what we wanted to have happen to them, and the time frame that story would take. And whether or not they were tied to events and things like that. So some of the stories take place over the whole summer. Some, like the one that I did, only happen over about a 2-week period. So it could be dropped in a place that made better sense. But even with that limited window, there was nowhere it would fit where the sequence of characters at this party could have been there.
Could have been like a dream and woke up and like, oh.
Yeah, I know. When you're doing high interest, low level, fiction, and words are kind of at a premium, you can't have superfluous,
It's like superfluous.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah. So and those are just one of the things that you do. And I think that collaboration. I think that we have the capacity to do this sort of thing a lot better because we have this greater level of instant communication and sending scripts and people can make editing and highlight things that I'm submitting to this Google Docs like within 5 minutes. There's red lines attached to it saying everything's great, you can't say this.
Or, I assume big Skype chats or whatever at a, in a conference room.
We did try that. We could never get it to work for whatever reason. There was always some gremlin keeping us from all being in the same chat room at once.
On a project like that, it seems like it would have to have a head writer or
There
story
was.
editor, some
The keeper of-
uber brain,
yes.
the keeper of the information.
Yes, the keeper of the book was her title, and she had the master a book that laid out all of the things about the characters and the timeline. And in fact, her master book, the keeper of the book, was a binder that had all the stories and the elements from the stories in chronological order, which at one point she had to read start to finish, as if it were a massive book about 8 characters, and to see whether or not anything jumped out as not fitting. And obviously there were voice shifts from authors and language and things like that, but it was only when a point when it could work that way that it got approved.
So structurally first, I would think interweaving all of taking your individual outlines, this was my job, and like physically taking the pages and putting them in temporal sequence for the summer and say, okay, this so-and-so did this, and then later that day, this other character in this other book did this. And does that make sense?
Yeah.
Before you even get into what people would think of as the writing, which is the characters and their interaction, but you've got to have a structure. You always think of writers being, we're just going to write anything, you don't be creative, and then we're going to buck against any kind of structure, but it's not true. You want to know what the heck you're writing, and that is a huge part of the writing process, if not the largest part of the writing process, is coming up with structurally what the heck are we all working on here, and then the fun can start, and you work on the characters actually. What do they say to each other, and at what point?
Much like with poetry, Robert Frost's analogy, tennis without a net, or whatever it
there
is.
you go.
You learn maybe how much rules is too many rules, and so that project had to be that rigid to let us realize that we could accomplish so much more if we loosened the rules a little bit. Now we're in the beginning stages of maybe doing another series that's called the Yearbook series, where it's high school kids, and it's one school year, and it's the same school year for all of them. But the difference with this one is that it's based on perception. It's very personal, to them in their heads. And there will be things that they'll be telling and relating the stories, and they will be telling the same scene from their perspective, where things will be flat out different. A argument or a conversation will come across, it will be written completely different depending on which stories are being told. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. People can read the whole series and kind of decide who may have been telling the truth or remembering it the most accurately. So their continuity doesn't affect us there, except in some.
Or continuity, it does affect you,
Yeah, it
because
does a
you
little bit.
purposely want to make sure you have conflicting
Right, at some
accounts
point.
in for character reasons, I would assume.
Yeah,
It's
the
not-
continuity is that we want this scene to be in different stories or
to
whatever.
inform something about the characters and the nature of their relationship and
And
the
so-
way they see each other.
And so to an alert reader who catches what things remain consistent from telling to telling, they can perceive and answer the mystery that none of the 8 characters ever satisfyingly figure out.
That's cool. That's a great idea. Also, I wanted to add, I've never heard that rule about Batman. And I also asked, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to send Batman to therapy?
Well, it seems
How boring is
obvious.
that?
Because if he gets over the thing with his parents, he can't save the city. The other one that we were talking about before is whether or not Batman can smile or laugh. You know, even though in the Killing Joke he ends up just, you know, doubled over or whatever. And so in working with the you know, the young kids books or whatever, where you have a more lighthearted Batman, for a while the thing was in place is, well, you know, he might be able to laugh, but he shouldn't smile. I don't know how that goes, you know, but
Yes, I'm
and
not at the same meetings.
then they lighten it
I
up.
haven't heard a lot of these rules.
So, well,
ever.
they dismissed it because, you know, they decided that kids like humor. So his humor just had to be more dry and like no puns. Puns are what the villains do. You know, they're all based on, you know, the tying into their crimes or whatever else. So their puns, and his is, you know, his style is, you know, the unexpected, you know, the almost
Seinfeld
right,
observational commentary.
yes, and general straight man to all of the villains.
But again, I guess I'm at the wrong meetings. I don't recall really being subjected to a lot of no kind of rules. You know, can't do this, can't do that, can't do this. It's more toy company driven. It's the rules, like the things I heard about Batman back at Fox Kids and then at Kids WB had to do with any children's television. No broken glass, no, you know, that's a big thing because, you know, this kicking a window and breaking, having a glass fly everywhere. That was a big thing that, you know, in animated series of Batman, you can't do that, you know, like the children's television. But you can't do that anywhere, not just Batman. So I don't recall being like confined to a specific character may never behave in this way. So you could try pitching anything and they could always say no.
So, some of you may not have been comic books fans or comic book readers during the Comics Code Authority era, but if you ever want to see what it's like to live under a fairly draconian level of somewhat arbitrary rules, go look up what the Comics Code Authority allows you to do or not do in a superhero comic.
Was this the days of Rob and Laura Petrie sleeping in separate beds and that kind of stuff?
It was for a long time, but it carried into the 80s and even early 90s, where the Comics Code Authority stamp on the book meant that it was good for kids and it wouldn't, you know, trust me, Batman and Robin is safe and it won't do anything to you know, awaken your child's sexuality or homosexuality or whatever it is, you know. And there are websites just devoted to, oh really, you know, here's Wonder Woman cover, here's a Wonder Woman cover, you know.
That's people obviously
Yes.
pushing back against.
But right, so you know, and there were things that a superhero could never say or do anything that goes against the concepts of like democracy or, you know, I mean, they could never disagree with the general premise that America is the greatest nation on earth.
Interesting. Any more questions, I should say, just in checking the time here. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to. And please feel free to just jump in.
Do you have any like a dream property that you'd like to write for at some point?
Sesame Street. I mean, let me think about that. Not Muppets for me, certainly. Anybody else? Give it some thought.
I've always wanted to write Jerry Anderson's UFO. You know, it's obscure now, a lot of people don't even remember it, but it's one of my favorite old sci-fi TV shows. And there were rumors, it was being rebooted as a movie a few years ago, but the production fell apart for some reason, so probably lost a chance.
The Thunderbird series.
But yeah, so it's like maybe they'll circle back around to UFO. But that was Jerry Anderson's first live-action, non-puppet show before he did Space 1999.
I tend to sway back and forth on what you know, my dream properties or opportunities might be. I'd love to do something with the, you know, I of comics I prefer Marvel, which is why I make a lot more references to them, you know, and yet ironically I end up having to help people, you know, dope out DC stuff. So, but you know, it's okay. It would be fun to write like a Captain America or a Thor thing for something that was, you know, licensed to say that, you know, I wrote something for those characters that I grew up in. You know, I would have always liked to have been part of a team that created the story structure for like an RPG, you know, video game, you know, because I find sort of like dialogue trees and you know, choice making sort of fascinating. Choose your own adventure, the way one thing can lead to another. I applied many times and never got hired to do that sort of thing. So I gave up and you know, wrote my own. I just put the video game stuff into the book and did it that way. So.
Going back to what you were asking, I'm going to tie in. Going back to what you were asking, if there is one person who like makes the DC live action universe make sense, maybe there isn't. Like, is there a person that, like, was there a vision, like, behind Zack Snyder's Superman and how that would possibly tie into a Justice League movie that people would want to watch? No, I don't think that there was. Why are there like 3 Hal Jordans right now?
Let me just throw this in there. Or there is, and they don't have any power corporately. You know, they can only, that's where the frustrations come in, I guess, in writing, so bring it back around as we near the wrap-up portion of our show here. Writing in other people's established universes, the executives, the editors, all the people that you think of as having, you know, the power when you say things come down from on high, where is on high? You know, like you think of, oh, the executive producer must be able to make the decisions. No, they answer to somebody. Oh, the person they answer to must be able to make the, no, they answer to somebody. They answer to, you know, who, like the corporate shareholders, who gets the final say on this? That's the tricky part.
The lawyers is the answer to that. the copyright lawyers, the copyright holders, the
ideally, you befriend people who, you know, corporately, you become somebody they can trust. Not just your opinion, but how you're going to execute the opinion, how you're going to get the team of people, you know, around you and working for you to sort of come together behind this. And once you've kind of built this trust, you can actually circumvent, like when you're talking about the rules and they can't do this, they can't do that. But, well, then there are the exceptions, like you mentioned, and the way those exceptions come about is somebody has garnered the trust of the collective that actually has the power to implement these decisions. You know, a lot of the people working on the properties, even at very high levels, are equally as frustrated as fans are when something falls out of continuity or falls, not out of continuity, but I think of it as out of character. This wouldn't, character for the property, like that wouldn't happen. You know, that's like, it's where things start seeming like fan fiction. Like this is supposed to be the real property, and it's like watching or reading fan fiction in tone, or there's something about it that's not quite right. A lot of the times the people behind the scenes feel the same way, but they're, for whatever reason, no matter how high up they are, they're not high up enough to prevent it or to change it.
I just want to say, like, talking about something like that, like, love the movie, like X-Men Days of Future Past, but it seems like any property that's anywhere near the 60s has to connect with Kennedy. Like, there's this some magnetic black hole force, just like Interstellar, where they're just like sucked towards this idea that some connection with Kennedy has to happen. It's just so terribly painful.
Whoever has the Kennedy license is raking it in. That's what it is.
Right. Exactly.
I'm sorry, I thought you were giving us a time check behind the camera here. You've got a question before it.
So is that character creation a rigid creation from the beginning, or are these rules something that they put in over time as a character progresses? So is it something that is fluid that can actually change because of something someone does way high up, or is it like, hey, we're creating this character and this is the set of rules that we're going to abide by throughout the character's life?
Yeah, I've never experienced this rigid set of rules that other people have mentioning. So in terms of having, from the very beginning, if I'm pitching a show or a comic book series, in original characters, you've got your series Bible, lowercase b, about who everybody is, what's the situation, is it in outer space, is it in the Old West, what exactly is this property? And there are rules in that. There's are these people brother and sister, or are they husband and wife? That's a rule, right? Like something, there are those kind of rules of who is everybody, what do they like, dislike, what are they afraid of, all these kind of things. But certainly things like that would change over time, some of the characters that...
Well, and then there's just, when you're talking about TV and movies and stuff, sometimes, like with say, J.J. Abrams, you know, the franchise kind of shifts over to someone else having the overall creative influence, and then you see things getting shaken up in the universe because someone else is in charge. They can break the rules that they want, because that's part of when you're the big boss guy, then you can break all the rules you want. It's the people below you that can't break the rules.
And what the audience reacts to. I mean, this is an old example, but it's from my childhood. Family Ties was a show that was about a couple from the 60s raising their kids in the 80s who had, you know, 80s Republican values. And then the Michael J. Fox character took off with the audiences, and it became his show. You know, sort of like the Urkel show. You know, I say the Urkel show, Family Matters. You know, that's not the way it was initially pitched and developed. It just, so that wasn't even something that came down from on high. That was like, wow, this is leading, the whole property's taken on a whole different life. If we want it to continue at all, if we don't want to get canceled, we better just go with the flow here and let it evolve into what the audience wants it to become. So it's not as authoritarian, you know, mean overlords coming down from on high, making us all creative people miserable. You know, it's not like that. It really isn't.
And if there's a wall that you're butting into, you know, we kind of, you know, project leaders, we may have made them seem a little bit more oppressive or whatever, but ultimately you are presenting it for an audience, and specifically, you know, like a paying audience. So the biggest point of pressure is between innovation and the idea of giving the audience what they want. Because what they want is a story that matches the character of the universe or the show or whatever that they love, and they want something new that expands on that, but they will often balk, you know, if things change too much on them or go outside of you know, the general collective vision. And so, you know, that can be tricky, but in navigating that, and the people who are sometimes sort of dictating these rules or suggesting these constraints or whatever, it's kind of to make sure that they can hit, you know, the target market, you know, as strong as possible. But there's always the chance for innovation in those pressure points where things pop out. And that's always where my favorite moments, you know, occur in fandom. These side characters that just shoot out from someplace where they should have never been and become as popular as they are. And so, like, from the DC side, Batman Beyond, Harley Quinn, which were all things that were added external of the comics, and then they made their way back to the comics because they took off. Or even with you know, you've got decades worth of you know, ideas on what Spider-Man has to be, but then all of a sudden things start shooting out the sides and taking off with people, and now you have the Spider-Verse where there are, you know, a dozen different perceptions on what Spider-Man or person can be, and many of them are great.
I wanted to springboard off of something you mentioned, and actually sort of by way of our wrap-up topic, for writing and established universes for the target market. But when it's an established universe, a Ninja Turtles, a Transformers, a Star Wars, Indiana Jones to some extent, these things have been around now for multiple generations, and so part of our challenge is, and Muppets too, as much as, you know, I love them from my childhood, but I'm not a child. That's not the audience now. Trying to write for an audience of me and you, and also the children who they want buying these new Ninja Turtle toys and watching the show, and I'm trying to reconcile what longtime fans hold dear about the property and what would be new and interesting, and not, it's tricky because in talking amongst my own friends who are fans, and a lot of them are also writers and illustrators, artists, all kinds of things, special effects people, it tends to get, as the evening wears on, people tend to think of it, it's dumbing down for the new generation. That term always comes up, we're dumbing it down. They didn't dumb Star Wars, if you think of it as like, it was dumb at the time, you know, I'm sure there were adults at the time saying that it was, you know, entertainment dumbed down for us. I still love it, the originals, it was awesome. Come on. Or the original Ghostbusters, you know, very little touches out, or Back to the Future. And I remember Back to the Future 2 coming out, and Bob Zemeckis being interviewed and saying that kind of something that you started to say, that audiences want to see the same movie over and over and over again. And he, of course, was foreshadowing Back to the Future and parallel scenes with Marty and his mom and that kind of stuff. But now that I do this for a living, I really see that it is a balancing act, trying to write for yourself and your your generation of fans, and why we love Batman, why we love, God, Sonic the Hedgehog, why you love whatever My Little Pony, of course. God, why didn't I bring that up? My Little Pony is a huge part of my life now, and there's the fans who have loved it all along, and then there's the kids who are discovering it now. And I knew of it back then, but I wasn't one of the diehard fans, a little too old for it at the time. And so I fall somewhere in between. Trying to hit the intended audience has gotten, what is the intended audience now, is become a big issue. Because you want of course they want to sell to everybody. You have an X-Men movie, you want adults, you want kids, you want teenagers, you want elderly people, you want middle-aged people, you want young. How do you reconcile all this? And it's tricky.
And they're getting smarter about it. And before the constraints were this is a kid's show, or this is a boys' show, or this is a girls' show,
or it's for the uber fans.
Right.
Like if you weren't a Batman fan back in the day, you're not a real fan. Like this, and I've always kind of been pushed out of it. You're not a real fan.
But the buzzword on that is accessible, and there are places that we were talking about things that it would be a dream to write for, and I always thought it would be a blast to write a Phineas and Ferb episode, because that is one of the places, like My Little Pony, where there are layers running across each other, where there's a thing where it's just flat out funny for somebody who's completely unfamiliar with it, or the child who's experiencing it for the first time, and there's a second layer right there that's an inside joke or a high five to somebody who's been there the whole time. That extra added, value to it.
And believe me, they do that on purpose.
I know they do, because they make a fan of both the child
Yes.
and the parent, and
it's the
somehow
most fun when you do it that way. 'Cause we're all
that is the
people
best.
working on it.
So inside jokes and high fives are kind of the way to go. You can actually smooth over a lot of rough edges in your property if you do a lot of hidden handshakes. And
I always kind of equate that phenomenon with old school Muppets. Sort of when I think, when you mention those aspects of My Little Pony or Phineas and Ferb, I think of them as being Muppety in terms of the writing, and that's obviously that's a property that's close to my heart. But I always think of when Muppets really changed wasn't with Jim Henson's death; it was with Jerry Jules. Of course, lesson involvement and then his death. It's not the actors doing the voices so much. It's the writing. Are these characters being written as their real, authentic selves? Of course, I always bring everything back to the Muppets, so somebody else has this on a different tone. I'll be talking about it.
I am a big fan of Muppets too, and I believe that they still can carry over, and there is the writing, and there's the injustice.
Yeah.
And if you go back and watch like the Muppet Show now versus like when you were younger or whatever,
Oh
you
my
can see
gosh,
those
yeah.
layers at play even then, which is part of
Not
what
in the Muppets,
what
or
made it
Sesame
good.
Street in the day. I mean, my
Mhm.
dad talking about the music was way too cool for toddlers.
Yeah,
They did on that show.
and there's stuff in there that you would think on the surface, you just might be too good. You gotta just have faith, in the kids to not freak out or whatever. And Muppets was for everybody, and so you have the thing, and I think it was the Great Muppet Caper or whatever. They're all talking or whatever. They quiet, and Janice is in the corner. This is my life, okay?
Yeah.
So if I just want to go to a beach and run around naked.
Yeah. But not even like risque stuff, just what you were saying before, references or I don't know, it's sort of a tone like there you go. My Little Pony for sure let us do that, and I know in the story meetings with Robin Zeddy and Lauren Faust that I had, there were times when they would tell me flat out, don't self-censor, just go that. Like we got to, there was one character who was a phoenix who was declining in health rapidly, like the smoker's cough and just all this stuff, and of course she's going to turn into ashes and rise at the end. But the kids watching certainly don't know that, and playing it along, and she just got more and more pathetic. I'm like, can we do this? Can we? Oh my God, Fluttershy's going to think she's more into this character to the kids. And they don't exactly. And another one we did with Rainbow Dash auditioning pets, and she just gets in this. She's got all these criteria for pets that she wants, but a little butterfly is you call that flapping? It gets in its face, and just for a show that's supposed to be aimed at the time very young. I'm like, oh, we really? Okay, that got us all to laughing in the room. Can we put that in the script? And like, absolutely. So I credit Lauren with allowing us to be what I call Muppety. To me, that's something that would have happened, in the Muppets. That dynamic, that type of joke. It doesn't have to be South Park, Simpsons, which I love, but it doesn't have to be that that aimed at adults.
Don't underestimate the 5-year-olds and what they can appreciate. I do
Absolutely.
childcare. We had one little girl a few years ago who was always Pinkie Pie whenever she played anything.
Mm-hmm. Yay.
They
I'm
can
a Twilight
appreciate a lot.
Sparkle myself.
And
I say that, although
if the
the
story,
Cheshire Cat I just brought from Tokyo Disney Sea, I just put in a plug for that theme park, for merchandising, one of my favorite characters.
if the story's good, the story's good. I go around, I do a lot of author talks, and I do a lot of school visits and things like that, talking about writing or whatever else. And one of the things I always bring up, for the audience, at some point, I try and introduce the idea that I'm a brony. And that I love these stories that you're talking about. I know every reference that you made or whatever. I said, do not, you can be allowed to like the things that you like, we were talking about the harsh, things that go on there. And the harshest thing about what a thing can't be when you're trying to write for it is this idea that, the boys won't like it, the girls won't like it, it doesn't go whatever. To have faith in people to appreciate a good story.
And characters, I think it's interesting that since you come from print and I come from television, you guys keep talking story and I keep talking character, that the story that's being told in an established universe here, if we're going from medium to medium with the same, I'm less concerned or even less interested in the story as a fan than I am in the characters being their consistent, authentic selves. But that may just be personal preference. It was interesting just during this whole panel for me to hear you guys keep talking story. I'm like, oh, I keep talking. I don't really care what the characters do. As long as they're themselves, I'll watch them do anything. Or read them
That's
do
why you have a
anything.
team.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is that our final farewell?
I think so.
We're down to the second.
I heard other panels clapping,
I did
so
too,
I figured
so
that
I'm
we
sort
were
of wait,
both
but
done.
I'll wait for the cue from on far, but I'll take it from you also. Well, thanks everybody. This was a lot of fun.
We had a moment.
We did.